The war was ending, but the roads were still full of ghosts. On a narrow dirt path cutting through the pine forest near Ludwigslust, a group of women walked slowly in mismatched civilian clothing. Scarves, worn coats, and thick wool skirts tried to hide what polished black boots revealed. Their faces were downturned, not from shame, but calculation. They were not fleeing bombs. They were fleeing names, identities inked into record books and tattooed into skin. These were not ordinary civilians. These were the women of the Reich's forgotten machinery, guards, administrators, nurses assigned to unspeakable duties. As towns fell and command centers collapsed, they stripped their uniforms, burned their documents, and blended into the exodus of displaced persons. But they carried themselves too straight. Their silence was too disciplined, their eyes too empty. Private Ruiz saw them first. His patrol was combing the western edge of the forest, expecting deserters or starving farmers. Instead, he saw a fire pit with women sitting around it, feigning domestic calm. One was slicing a raw potato with a military-issue field knife. Another hummed a lullaby while staring at the dirt. They weren't startled to see Americans. They were performing a scene. One rehearsed a limp. Another pretended to cry. When Sergeant Monroe arrived, the women stood in silence. One of them, red-haired and younger than the rest, held up her hands and spoke fluent English. "We are civilian nurses," she said. "We surrendered 3 days ago." Monroe didn't respond. His eyes moved to the boots, then to the posture, then to the smirk hiding in the corners of their mouths. Ruiz moved in closer and noticed the woman holding the Bible was gripping it upside down. Private Keene chuckled and whispered, "I've seen better liars in school plays." Monroe wasn't amused. He ordered the women to sit, hands on their knees, and asked for identification. Most had none. One presented a forged ration card. Another presented a Catholic certificate with her name misspelled. Monroe stepped toward the woman with the Bible. "Left sleeve," he said. She hesitated. Ruiz stepped forward and gently pulled it back. There it was, a faded blood-type tattoo, standard issue for SS personnel. The woman said nothing. Another woman behind her immediately started weeping, burying her face in her hands. Monroe gave a quiet nod, and the soldiers began searching their coats and satchels. Inside a leather pouch, they found a partial list of inmate numbers. In another, a letter from an SS regional office signed by a name that appeared in Allied war crime bulletins. The mood shifted. Laughter faded. What had seemed like a pitiful group of lost women quickly became something else. Trained personnel who had worked in the camps, transported prisoners, handled records. One name matched a document linked to child selections at Ravensbrück. Another had previously been a known administrator at a sub-camp near Uckermark. These were not low-level clerks. They had been part of the system's operational core. The women no longer claimed to be nurses. They said nothing. The fire went out. Soldiers gathered the confiscated documents and brought in extra guards. Monroe requested immediate transport and secure holding. "These ones," he said, "are not for a local jail." Ruiz didn't speak. He simply stood at the tree line, watching the group, now seated in rows, heads lowered, not in humility, but in waiting. They knew what had been found. That evening, the youngest among them began to sing. Her voice was soft, childlike, but the lyrics were clear. It was a lullaby used in Ravensbrück, played over loudspeakers as prisoners were sorted. Ruiz had heard it once before, during a liberation 2 weeks earlier. He turned away and walked back toward the vehicles. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The myth had broken. What they had found wasn't a war crime unit. It was the aftermath of a belief. The Reich had fallen, but what these women carried hadn't. It lingered in their silence, their eyes, their careful lies. The forest around Ludwigslust became still once more. But the dirt had seen something it would never forget. And so had Ruiz. By the time the women were escorted to the edge of the clearing, the sun had begun to lean westward, casting long shadows between the trees. The American soldiers moved with quiet efficiency. No yelling, no threats. This wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was a processing zone. Yet tension hung in the air like wet wool. Ruiz walked behind the line of women, noting how differently they moved now. The rehearsed calm had cracked. One woman's hands trembled behind her back. Sergeant Monroe ordered the squad to separate the group into smaller units. 5 here, 5 there, 3 in the middle. He gestured without shouting. These women weren't being arrested like civilians. They were being categorized. One soldier muttered under his breath, "They say the worst ones never ran. They just blended in and waited." Ruiz didn't answer. He was watching one particular woman, the redhead with the upside-down Bible. Her eyes were open, but she blinked too often. He'd seen that before. Inside the farmhouse, Corporal Lang and Private Keene began laying out the confiscated items. ID tags, forged permits, a stack of neatly folded cloth armbands with faded red and black insignia. One document stood out, a transport schedule from late March 1945, marked urgent. It listed 2 train stops and a destination camp known only in whispers, Uckermark. Monroe read it twice. Then he folded it silently and slid it into his inner coat pocket. We have to call this in. Outside, the women sat on crates and overturned buckets. A few whispered to each other, but most remained still, their gazes unfocused. One of them, older than the rest, was slowly peeling bark from a stick, as if it helped her pass time in a world that no longer existed. Ruiz approached her and asked her name. "Marta. I was a cook." He asked if she had ever served in a camp. She said no. When asked what year she joined the party, she said 1938. Ruiz didn't push. He just walked away. Later, Monroe called for a portable field table and began preliminary interrogation. Each woman was brought forward one by one. Answers were short. Name, origin, party affiliation. When one woman, tall, gaunt, with prominent cheekbones, claimed she had only typed letters, Lang placed a sheet in front of her, a list of experimental injection schedules with her initials on the corner. She didn't deny it. She didn't blink. She just said, "I didn't choose where they sent me." Ruiz stepped out for a moment and lit a cigarette. The air outside was colder now and quiet, the kind of quiet that usually comes after gunfire, even though none had been fired. Inside, Monroe was still working. He wasn't yelling, wasn't threatening. He was documenting, recording words that would soon become statements. But Ruiz knew most of these women wouldn't talk, not because they were defiant, but because they had rehearsed their silence just like they had rehearsed their surrender. One woman began to cry, not from guilt, but frustration. She insisted they had been abandoned. She said, "They told us to stay put. They said the Americans would treat us like civilians." Monroe didn't respond. He simply wrote it down. She looked at him, shaking, and added, "You think we enjoyed it?" He paused, met her eyes, and replied, "I think you stopped caring." By dusk, 3 more names had been matched to Allied war crime bulletins. 2 of the women were identified as having served in medical roles at facilities where mass sterilizations had occurred. Another, previously claiming to be a railway clerk, had been present during selections at Bergen-Belsen. The paper trail was thin, but it was enough. They would not be released. Not to the local police, not to the Red Cross. These were women who would face military tribunals. Ruiz sat near the truck as the women were loaded in. Their faces were blank, but something else now lingered. Resentment. Not fear, not remorse. They were no longer pretending. One looked directly at him and said nothing, just stared. Ruiz stared back. He had spent weeks fighting ghosts, clearing bunkers, watching men die, but this moment felt heavier. These women had killed nothing with their hands, and yet somehow the weight of them was more permanent than any corpse. As the truck door slammed shut and the engine rumbled to life, Ruiz turned to Monroe and asked, "You think they'll talk at the tribunal?" Monroe shrugged. "Won't matter. The papers already did." The truck disappeared down the tree-lined road, kicking up dust in the fading light, and the forest returned to silence. But for Ruiz, the wait would follow. They arrived at the temporary holding station just before midnight. An old munitions depot had been repurposed by the Americans into a processing center for captured personnel. There were no flags, no symbols, just concrete walls and cold light. The women were lined up outside in silence, waiting to be documented. Ruiz remained at the rear of the truck, his rifle slung but his attention fixed. No one had spoken during the entire journey. That, more than anything, unsettled him. Inside, each woman was taken one by one to a desk staffed by 2 officers and a translator. Monroe oversaw the intake. Name, age, place of birth, party membership, wartime assignments. Some still lied. Others repeated the same lines. "I was a clerk. I just typed orders. I didn't know what the trains were for." But Monroe had a folder with names, camp photos, survivor testimonies. He wasn't asking to learn. He was asking to confirm. Ruiz stepped inside as the third woman, mid-30s, gaunt, gray eyes, took the chair. Her voice was quiet but unwavering. "Ilse, born in Leipzig. I worked in a women's canteen." Monroe handed her a paper. On it was her photograph from 1942, standing in front of a gate marked with the insignia of a now liberated subcamp. Her signature was on the back. Ilse looked at it, then at Monroe, and simply said, "I thought that picture was destroyed." The fourth woman denied everything, even her own name. She refused to speak in German or English. The translator tried French. Nothing. She sat perfectly still, arms folded, face blank. Ruiz leaned forward, slowly removed a pin from the scarf she was wearing, and revealed a strip of black cloth with faded embroidery, a transport unit code. Not many would recognize it, but Ruiz had seen it in a briefing 2 weeks earlier. She was listed. She was wanted. Now she was known. By the time they reached the 7th woman, the atmosphere had thickened. Even the guards were less casual now. One woman had broken down crying when her alias was matched to a Bergen-Belsen file. Another had begun speaking rapidly, offering names and timelines, hoping cooperation would reduce punishment. Monroe didn't react. He simply filed the papers and moved on to the next. The weight of what these women represented had sunk in. There would be no shortcuts. The 8th woman caught Ruiz's attention, not because she resisted, but because she looked relieved. She gave her name, Anna, without hesitation, said she worked in a sorting office outside Dresden. When asked what she sorted, she replied, "Children." The translator froze. Monroe paused. Ruiz clenched his jaw. "What do you mean, sorted?" She didn't change expression. Clothes, ages, train numbers. As if logistics could be sterilized into innocence. Later that night, Ruiz sat with Monroe outside the depot. A small fire cracked in a rusted barrel nearby. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Ruiz said, "They still don't get it." Monroe nodded. "Some do, but too late, too convenient." Ruiz took a long drag from his cigarette. Monroe replied, "They were built for paperwork." Then he stood and walked inside. Ruiz stayed behind. He thought about the woman who said she sorted children, about the scarf, the silence in the truck, the singing. Not one of them had begged. Not one had asked to be spared, as if shame had been replaced by habit. He remembered a survivor's voice from a week ago, trembling behind a broken accent. She had a name. She smiled while holding the list. The morning came without ceremony. A new convoy was arriving. More women, more names, more files. Ruiz folded his coat over his shoulder and walked back toward the intake tent. He didn't feel righteous. He didn't feel victorious. He felt tired. Tired of facts, tired of secrets, tired of watching people reveal the truth only when no other option remained. The photo came from a pile of unsorted intelligence reports delivered from a liberated Nazi archive outside Magdeburg. Folded between old camp logs and ration orders, it was just another piece of evidence until someone looked closer. In it, a woman stood beside a railway ramp, clipboard in hand, speaking to a uniformed officer. Her hair was tied back tightly, her coat pressed. She was not watching the arriving prisoners. She was counting them. Ruiz saw the image on Monroe's desk that morning. He leaned in, eyes narrowing. The face looked familiar, but not from the past, from yesterday. "That's her," he said. Monroe didn't look up. "We're verifying," he replied, but his tone lacked doubt. The woman in the photograph bore the same eyes as the one in holding cell 3, the same slight tilt of the chin, the same habit of glancing left before speaking. Only now she had claimed to be a teacher. The officer in the photo had already been identified, SS Obersturmführer Emil Kranz, executed by Soviet forces 3 weeks earlier. That placed the photograph around early 1944 at the arrival platform of Neuengamme subcamp. The clipboard, barely legible, showed a list with check marks. Monroe enlarged the photo and noticed a second detail. The same woman handing over the clipboard to another female, younger, barely 20, with the same armband. A chain of command, recorded by accident. Ruiz entered the holding area. Cell 3 was quiet. The woman sat on a cot, hands folded neatly, posture untouched by fatigue. He showed her the photo without a word. She stared at it for 5 seconds, then said, "That's not me." Ruiz didn't react. "We enlarged it. The armband is unique. Only 8 were issued in that unit." She leaned back and said, "Then I was number 9. Her smile was faint but real. Ruiz noted it. So did Monroe, watching through the glass. Later, during formal questioning, Monroe presented the list from the clipboard, recovered from the same folder as the photo. Names, dates, and next to each a single letter, L, S, or D. The Allied analysts had decoded them the night before. L, labor. S, selection. D, death. The woman looked at it and asked, "Which letter did you get?" Monroe said nothing. Ruiz almost did. The room stayed silent for a full minute. Then she spoke again, voice still steady. "Do you think we remembered all of them? Each face, each name?" Monroe answered coldly. "They remembered yours." She didn't respond, not with words, just a shrug, calculated, dismissive. The same gesture she'd made on the ramp as the transport rolled in, as if numbers erased people and repetition erased guilt. That night, Ruiz sat with the photo again. He studied the background this time, the blurred faces descending from the train, the child with no shoes, the elderly man being carried. In the corner, barely visible, was another female officer, the same armband, different face. They all had names, but only one smiled for the camera. It was her. The smile wasn't wide, but it was unmistakable. A quiet pride in execution. By dawn, orders came from division headquarters. The woman would be transferred to a high-level war crimes tribunal in Luxembourg. Monroe signed the handover forms without comment. As the escort team entered the holding area, the woman stood and adjusted her collar. "Do I get to speak?" she asked. Monroe said yes. She smiled again. Ruiz didn't follow them to the trucks. He stayed behind, watching the photograph pinned to the board. That image, more than any testimony, told the story, not of policy or politics, but of how ordinary someone could look while arranging death. The tribunal at Luxembourg wouldn't begin for another 3 weeks, but the holding site, an old cavalry barracks repurposed for pre-trial containment, was already full of ghosts in human form. Women who had once given orders without blinking now sat in wire-fenced courtyards, passing the hours in silence or mumbling to themselves in the corner. Ruiz arrived with the transport team just after dawn. He wasn't assigned to the trial staff. He came because he had questions. The woman from Cell 3, Annalise Trapp, was seated on a bench when Ruiz entered the intake office. Her posture hadn't changed. Same straight back, same controlled expression. But her hands, folded neatly in her lap, trembled slightly. Ruiz noticed, but said nothing. Monroe had already submitted her file. It was thick. Her position at Neuengamme had been verified by 4 separate sources. Her signature appeared at least 3 transport rosters. Ruiz sat across from her in the courtyard hours later. No guards, no clipboard, just 2 people facing one another under an overcast sky. He didn't ask her about the orders, the rosters, the testimony. Instead, he asked, "Why didn't you leave?" She didn't flinch. "You could have run, changed your name, crossed into Denmark. Half of them did, but you stayed." She looked away for the first time. Her voice was calm, but slower than before. "Because someone had to answer the door." He didn't respond at first. She continued, "Do you think the camps stopped working because Berlin fell? There were still deliveries, still trains, still rules. Someone had to be there to receive them. Someone had to pretend it wasn't collapsing." Her tone wasn't defensive. It was almost confessional, but not with regret, with ritual, as if she'd said this line before, maybe to herself, maybe to someone else who didn't care. Ruiz leaned forward. "You didn't believe it was over, did you?" She replied, "I believed it wasn't allowed to end." Later, he walked the perimeter of the barracks, passing other prisoners behind mesh fencing. Some looked back, most didn't. There was a strange calm across the complex, a quiet not born of peace, but of resignation. Like all the spinning wheels of the machine had stopped at once, and the operators were waiting to see if someone would reach in and start it again. Ruiz lit a cigarette and leaned against the stone wall. There was nothing else to do. That night, he returned to the intake room and reviewed the secondary interviews. A different woman, unrelated to Annalise, had broken down during questioning. Her words were scattered, half German, half prayer, but one phrase kept returning. She stayed, she stayed. Ruiz asked the interpreter what she meant. The man shrugged. They say it like a ghost story, as if her staying was more terrifying than any man running. Ruiz flipped through more reports. One from a Czech survivor, describing a red-haired female officer standing at the gates of the women's yard, clipboard in hand, long after the guards had fled. She wasn't yelling, she wasn't even moving, just standing, watching. Ruiz looked at the date, April 28. That was 3 days after the last official evacuation order. He closed the file and leaned back in the chair. She hadn't just stayed because no one told her to run. She stayed because someone had to keep pretending the system still existed. And pretending is sometimes more dangerous than believing. In the early hours, just before shift change, Ruiz passed her cell one last time. She wasn't asleep. She was sitting on the edge of her cot, facing the wall, humming something faintly under her breath. The tune was slow, almost tuneless. Ruiz paused, listened, and kept walking. He didn't want to know the melody. The tribunal hall in Luxembourg was unlike anything Ruiz had seen during the war. There were no sandbags, no helmets, no urgency. Just wooden benches, green lamp-shaded desks, and translation equipment humming softly beneath the sound of history trying to organize itself. On the wall behind the judges hung a single banner, not of a nation, but of the tribunal itself, neutral, declarative, final. For many, this was justice. For Ruiz, it was the final echo of something that had already rotted in silence. Annalise Trapp was seated at the far end of the witness box. She wasn't in chains. The court didn't use them. Instead, she wore a pale gray dress with no insignia. Her hair was pinned back, her posture straight. Ruiz sat in the observation row, hands clasped, staring at her face. She looked no different than the day she was brought in. The same calm, the same economy of movement, as if nothing around her could affect what she had already accepted. The prosecutor began by reading aloud her service record. Each line carried weight: camp assignments, administrative authorizations, confirmation of unit affiliation. But the moment that shifted the room came when he opened a thin envelope and removed a single sheet of paper, an affidavit signed by another woman in custody. The room stilled. He read it slowly, clearly. The statement named Annalise as the officer present during a specific train unloading at Neuengamme on March 3, 1945. It was signed and dated under oath. Annalise didn't flinch. When asked for a response, she simply said, "Yes." The judges conferred briefly, then allowed the prosecution to continue. The next document was harder to read. It contained a translated account from a Polish survivor describing a red-haired female officer separating children from parents during intake. There was no name attached, but the physical description matched. The prosecutor asked, "Do you deny this account refers to you?" She responded, "There were others with red hair." Outside the chamber, Monroe met with the lead archivist, who had been working with French and British staff to cross-reference captured German documents with personal testimonies. One folder had surfaced, buried in a collapsed administrative building outside Hamburg. It contained original typed forms signed by Annalise, authorizing prisoner transfers under exceptional logistics orders. That phrase had been used frequently in the last months of the war to bypass Geneva restrictions. Ruiz reviewed the papers in silence. Her signature was precise, even beautiful. When court reconvened after lunch, the defense presented no challenge. Annalise herself declined to speak further. "My words won't change the paper," she said. One of the judges asked, "Do you feel responsible for what happened under your authority?" She replied, "Authority doesn't mean control." Her voice was even, but the interpreter hesitated. The translation sounded more like, "I didn't have a choice." That evening, Ruiz sat alone in the back corner of the barracks' small chapel, a place used mostly by guards seeking silence rather than prayer. He stared at the wooden crucifix, then down at his boots, still caked with dust from the transport yard. He wasn't religious, but something about sitting in that room after hearing her words made him feel hollow. The tribunal was doing its job, but the war hadn't ended with rules. It had ended with ritual, with order, with people like her keeping the machinery warm, even when no one was left to give orders. He pulled from his coat a small photo, one that hadn't been submitted to the court. It showed a child, roughly 8 years old, standing beside a barbed wire fence with a number tag hanging from his neck. In the background was Annalise, blurry but visible. He had found it in a folder labeled "Routine Processing." Nothing about the photo was routine. Not the child's expression, not the way she was looking at the guard next to her, not the fact that someone thought to file it under that title. Later that night, Monroe joined him outside the chapel. They said little. Eventually, Ruiz asked, "Do you think she feels anything?" Monroe replied, "If she does, she keeps it folded somewhere deep, like those rosters." Ruiz nodded. "Folded like paper." Then he stood up and walked toward the lights of the barracks, unsure if what he had witnessed that day was justice, memory, or just procedure pretending to be truth. The weather shifted sharply on the morning of Annalise's transfer. Heavy rain fell across Luxembourg, soaking the cobblestones outside the tribunal and painting the gray uniforms of the MPs into darker shades. The vehicle that would take her to Nuremberg arrived early, flanked by 2 support trucks. There was no announcement, no ceremony, just a name crossed off a list and a door opened. Ruiz stood in the hallway outside her cell as Monroe oversaw the final documentation. The guards were tense. Something about this transfer felt heavier than the others. Maybe because she had spoken, maybe because she hadn't begged, maybe because she made it easy. Ruiz didn't speak to her, not at first. He simply watched as she stepped into the corridor, coat folded over her arm, head held high. She turned to him briefly, as if waiting for a question. He asked, "Is there anything you want to leave behind?" She blinked once, then said, "There's a page in my file. I didn't write it for them. I wrote it for whoever read it last." He didn't answer, just nodded. Later, while the convoy pulled away, he found the page she mentioned, buried between roster reports and procedural letters. It was handwritten on old Reich letterhead without date or signature. The first line read, "The system failed because we thought routine would save us." What followed wasn't a confession nor a denial. It was a list, brief notes, one-liners, incomplete thoughts, some crossed out, some underlined. Child with green ribbon on wrist, didn't cry. Lang misfiled the April 3rd train logs. We stopped using names the second week. No one looked at their faces after the stamp. I think we lost the war long before Berlin. Monroe stood beside Ruiz as he read. Neither said anything for a long while. Finally, Monroe murmured, "She wrote like a clerk, not a killer." Ruiz didn't look up. Maybe that's worse. He folded the paper and placed it back where he found it. Not to hide it, but because some truths, once recorded, don't need to be repeated. They simply wait to be seen by someone ready to understand what they mean. That afternoon, the barracks emptied room by room. More transfers, more paperwork. The war was long over in words, but its structure still moved through files, signatures, and process. Ruiz completed his last duty roster and packed his things. He didn't take souvenirs, no documents, no photographs. Only the memory of a woman who had stayed until the very end, not out of duty, but because no one else did. Outside the compound, Ruiz walked past the gate, boots sinking slightly in the wet gravel. He lit a cigarette and looked back once, not at the building, but at the idea of it. The entire structure of silence, of roles, of paperwork, of people like Annalise who believed they were simply continuing a task while history bled under their feet. He didn't return to Berlin. He requested reassignment and spent the following months in small towns, writing names on walls for survivors, searching for families. Sometimes he recognized the names, sometimes he didn't, but he always wrote them carefully, letter by letter, as if reversing what had been stamped.